Does the History Channel spread misinformation? Reminder to hit the subscribe button below to stay up to date with new videos as they come out. Yes, this video is about being prepared for Jehovah's Witnesses, but at the same time, we're going to address a larger issue with how history in general is presented to us. From our last video, we saw that the Watchtower Society and the Da Vinci Code have been sharing a false narrative about how the Church and Constantine started the greatest lie that Jesus is God. That was easily shown to be wrong with 200 straight years of the church leaders consistently and directly calling Jesus God. Well, the same is true of the History Channel with their viewpoint of Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. Here's what one of their online articles has to say. First, they say Constantine converted to Christianity in 312. It is largely believed that Constantine had some type of conversion, and it is known that he wasn't baptized until his deathbed. But what isn't typically shared is that he was baptized by Eusebius of Nicomedia. Why that is important is because this Eusebius, not the one that we typically hear about, the historian from Caesarea, is that he was an Arian, which the Council of Nicaea found heretical. The article goes on to say that Constantine presided over the opening of the council and contributed to the discussion. Why this is misleading is because there are no recorded minutes from the council to know exactly what was said and by who. So if you are a novice to history and then flip on the History Channel, and this is your first experience with this, what would you take away from this? Likely you would think that the Christian Emperor Constantine led the march to make Christianity the dominant force in the empire. So what we need is a better perspective of what was taking place in the 4th century AD. This starts with an overview of the empire's history. Rome was founded as a kingdom initially in 753 BC. This kingdom was changed to a republic ruled by a senate from 509 to 27 BC. It was during the 2nd century BC that the rise of the republic became the dominant power as the former strength of the Greek Empire was deteriorating. The shift of governmental power from the Senate to the Emperor took full form under Augustus in 27 BC. After 400 years, the empire officially divided into two separate empires of the Western Roman and the Eastern Byzantine. Something to take away from the Western Empire timeline is that it didn't last very much longer after the Council of Nicaea. Zooming in now on the Roman emperors, we start off in the 1st century with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, followed with the Flavian dynasty taking over at the time of the Jewish revolt. This period is also known as the New Testament period or the Apostolic Age. Going into the 2nd century, we see stability with the Nerva-Antonian dynasty with only 7 emperors that ruled. Come the 3rd century, stability within the empire starts to get pretty shaky. The Severan dynasty only lasted 40 years, which created a power vacuum of emperors for the next 50 years. During this 90-year period, the empire goes through 28 emperors because of constant insurrection and assassinations taking place. It can easily be seen that the empire is in dire need of stabilization at the governmental level. This brings us to the end of the 3rd century with a new emperor determined to bring this about. His name is Diocletian. Diocletian's dream was to get the empire back to its glory days of military strength and governmental rule. He sets up the tetrarchy of rulership that splits the empire into 4 geographic areas with an emperor ruling in the east and in the west, with also a Caesar as a sub-ruler to both halves of the empire. The tetrarchy lasted for about 40 years after much infighting brought about the Constantinian dynasty and the Valentinian dynasty finishing out the 4th century AD. After Theodosius' death, the empire officially divided with the Roman Empire in the west and in the Byzantine in the east. Now the big picture of the 3rd and 4th century is that the collapse of the Roman Empire was due to instability within the government and not because of the Christian population was becoming the dominant force. Yet again, if you were reading the History Channel's 8 Reasons Why Rome Fell, you would see number 7 planting the idea that Christianity shares part of the blame. It reads, "The decline of Rome dovetailed with the spread of Christianity, and some have argued that the rise of a new faith helped contribute to the empire's fall. The Edict of Milan legalized Christianity in 313 and then later became the state religion in 380. These decrees ended centuries of persecution." That's a good thing, like ending the concentration camps during World War II. But they may have also eroded the traditional Roman value system. Traditional values like pagan prostitution, torture, persecution, governmental fear, and even death? Oh gosh, what terrible values to lose. The article goes on. Christianity displaced the polytheistic Roman religion. which viewed the emperor as having a divine status, and also shifted focus away from the glory of the state and onto a sole deity. Meanwhile, popes and other church leaders took an increased role in political affairs, further complicating governance. They're saying when Christianity got inside governments that's when it got complicated. See the portrayal as if the empire was getting jacked up because of Christians? You'll see how dumb this notion is in a little bit. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon was the most famous proponent of this theory, but his take has since been widely criticized. While the spread of Christianity may have played a small role in curbing Roman civic virtue, most scholars now argue that its influence paled in comparison to military, economic, and administrative factors. So pale that it should be really deemed invisible. Why this is the proper viewpoint is because of the edicts that were being passed prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325. Most have heard of the Edict of Milan in 313 that legalized Christianity, but what it really did was legalize all religions, not just Christianity. Also, this was done by two emperors, Constantine and Licinius, not just Constantine as it usually is spoken of as if he was alone. 2 years before the Edict of Milan, an edict was issued by Eastern Emperor Galerius known as the Edict of Toleration. This halted the confiscation of property and money from Christians that was legal to do at the time. A question has to be asked is why were these edicts even necessary to begin with? The reason goes back to 303 AD when Diocletian instigated what is known as the Great Persecution. It was during this time where Christians were stripped of all legal rights, military members were kicked out, money and church property were confiscated, scriptures were burned, and the government was forcing clergy to sacrifice to pagans in altars under the threat of execution or potentially being burned alive. So the whole notion that the Christians were amassing in numbers and in strength that overthrew the empire is a joke at best. A parallel to this would be with the Nazi Germany's persecuting the Jews during World War II. Diocletian, like Hitler, had to cast blame somewhere for the nation's problems. So Diocletian blamed the Christians as why the Roman Empire was weakening. So from all these edicts, there is no way Christians had the strength or the organization to even revolt even if they wanted to. Diocletian's whole goal was to wipe out Christianity from the empire. After 8 years, the Eastern Emperor Galerius realized that this wasn't working. So just prior to his death, he issued the Edict of Toleration. Sometimes this is portrayed as if this was the beginning of the rise and takeover of Christianity through Constantine. But again, Constantine wasn't even involved in this edict. He was in Great Britain and wasn't even recognized as the emperor in the West at this time either. Here's what Galerius actually said. Among other arrangements which we are always accustomed to make for the prosperity and welfare of the Republic, we had desired formerly to bring all things into harmony with the ancient laws and public order of the Romans, and to provide that even the Christians who had left the religion of their fathers should come back to reason, since indeed the Christians themselves, for some reason, had followed such a caprice and had fallen into such a folly that they would not obey the institutes of antiquity. So far, Galerius is saying that he was trying to bring back Christian converts who stopped worshiping pagan gods like Neptune, Jupiter, Mars, or whoever. He goes on to say, "They would thus make laws unto themselves which they should observe, and would collect various peoples in diverse places and congregations. Finally, when our law had been promulgated to the effect that they should conform to the institutes of antiquity, many were subdued by the fear of danger, many even suffered death. Wherefore, for this our indulgence, they ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own, that the Republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes." So what did Galerius actually say? Number one, we were just doing this for the good of the Republic. We're basically not sorry for killing or burning Christians. We just thought it was the best way to bring them back into the fold and worshiping the old pagan gods like we used to in antiquity. And also, number two, you gotta stop taking their stuff. You can't steal their property or money any longer. Does this really sound like strong language protecting Christians? Or more like, the plan isn't working, so we're just gonna shut it down for right now? Next, we have the Edict of Milan. Again, an important thing to remember is that Constantine wasn't the sole issuer of this edict. Licinius in the east also agreed to it because he largely needed the alliance with Constantine, as he was still fighting to be the sole emperor of the east. Two things really came out of this. One was the freedom of religion to all citizens, and number two, all restitution of confiscated property. Like the prior edict, this edict did not turn the empire into a Christian state. Now we know that the Council of Nicaea only comes 12 years later after the Edict of Milan, but an improper thought would be that it was nothing but smooth sailing for Christians after that point, as if this was the small window of time where Christians started to rise to dominance. Keep in mind, if Constantine wanted to make Christianity the sole religion of the state, all he had to do was issue it. He was the emperor. Whatever he said became law. So like I said before, the infighting was more of the problem than the rise of the Christian population inside the empire. In 311, there was 4 people calling themselves emperor, with Constantine and Maxentius in the west and Licinius and Maximinus in the east. Each pair was opposed to one another. Constantine and Licinius formed an alliance through marriage, and Maxentius and Maximinus formed an alliance to counter theirs. By the end of 313, the empire was back being ruled by 2 emperors, Constantine in the west and Licinius in the east. Shortly after Licinius took control of the east, he started to renege on his commitments to protecting Christians, and battles between him and Constantine started to ensue. By 317, Constantine gained control over the Macedonian territory. In 320, the Great Civil War for the Roman Empire was fully ignited. This has largely been portrayed as a Christian versus pagan war, which again is a really bad viewpoint because Christians were just getting back on their feet from a decade of death and 17 years earlier being kicked out of the military. By 324, Constantine had become the sole emperor of the whole empire, establishing the Constantinian dynasty. He made Byzantium the official capital of the empire, which was later renamed Constantinople after him. This is modern-day Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. Another idea to correct is that Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. When Diocletian named Maximian co-emperor of the West in 286 BC, the capital of the West was in Milan, not in Rome. That's why the Edict of Milan was called the Edict of Milan, because it was done in Milan and not in Rome. This brings us to 325, with the Council of Nicaea being called by Constantine. Keep in mind, it's only been 1 year since the Great Civil War had ended. It's not been 3 decades of Christianity slowly taking over the power inside the empire. There are few primary sources that can be used to know exactly what took place at the Council of Nicaea. Outside of these, anything else added is pure speculation. Now, what we know is that Constantine invited around 1,800 bishops, and about 290 actually showed up. Largely, these bishops were from the east, because trekking from Great Britain over to Turkey is no simple task. Third, there was no minutes kept. So there is no going back to analyze the dialogue to see if Constantine was forcing his hand on the bishops to make Jesus out to be God, or any other pagan idea would be instituted inside of the church. Fourth, we know the results that ultimately produced the Nicene Creed that is still read today in many churches. So again, the History Channel's description that Constantine added to the discussion is mere speculation. There are no minutes to know exactly what he did, said, or even if he was present throughout all the meetings that lasted over a month. He probably had to attend to other duties like governing the reunified empire and not just listening in on a month-long debate to see if Jesus was God or not. So whether it's the History Channel, the Jehovah's Witnesses, or anyone that describes Constantine's role as something more than the one who called for the council to take place, is arguing from speculation and from silence. They might say, well, you can't prove that he wasn't there the entire time, or that he didn't have influence over the bishops. Okay, so I need to prove negatives to you to satisfy your conspiratorial viewpoint? See how foolish this thinking is? And it's a bad route to ask for the other side to prove negatives in general. There were a few things that were discussed at the council, but the main issue was, how is Jesus related to the Father? Was he created, or was he eternal? If he's eternal, is he of the same substance, or is he some different substance in some other manner? After a month of debate, 286 signed the Nicene Creed that states Jesus is the eternal God and of the same substance. How many opposed to this? 2. So the big controversy that called for this council to be convened ultimately had a whopping 2 bishops that didn't agree in the end to sign the Nicene Creed. This shows that Jesus was always taught to be the eternal and almighty God. In spite of all the persecution, the core doctrine of who Jesus is didn't change over the course of the centuries. So a recap of everything that played up to the Council of Nicaea started with a great persecution in 303 under Diocletian, and that the day-to-day social and political peace for Christians didn't take place until after 324 when Constantine became the sole emperor. But throughout all the persecution, believers and church leaders maintained their faith that Jesus is God incarnate, and that this long-held doctrine became officially recognized at the Council of Nicaea in 325. There was never a conspiracy led by militant Christians headed up by Constantine. It was just the church maintaining the same gospel message that was taught 300 years earlier by the apostles. So rest assured that church history has always been consistent on this doctrine, and that you have no need to worry about when the next charlatan comes around selling his new book or what even gets portrayed on TV. In our next video, we'll explore post-Nicene history that will drive the final nail in the coffin to the militant Christian conspiracy viewpoint. In the meantime, stay salty.